welcome to Storytelling for Healthy Change. I'm Gail Brooks, and I'm the founder and principal strategist of the Black Cross. We have partnered with Mercy Care, Archie, Georgia Seal, to bring you this training today. I'll speak a little bit more on that in a second. But first, let me please introduce my lovely colleague, who you also see here on the screen, LaToya Hester.
Hi, everyone. I'm a trainer and strategist with the Black Cross, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Great, thank you. So before we jump into everything, I just wanted to make a couple of acknowledgements. First, again, thank you to Mercy Care Atlanta, who has partnered with us to bring this together, as well as helping us to continue messaging around COVID-19, the COVID vaccine, and other health equity issues here in the Atlanta area. Thank you to the Health Resources and Services Administration, often known as HRSA, who provided the grant funding to support these efforts. And of course, thank you to our partners, Georgia Seal. Georgia Seal does tremendous work around the state to get people educated on and vaccinated for COVID-19. They also do quite a bit of research around drivers and solutions to health disparities. A special shout out to Brittany Taylor, who we know holds down quite a bit of activity over there. Thank you to Archie, or Atlanta Regional Collaborative for Health Innovation. In particular, I'd like to thank Carrie Oliver and Aisha Williams, who've run point on this partnership and this project. And then finally, of course, I'd like to thank Fulton County again, who was our anchor partner in Alive and in Color, who you'll hear more about. And was very instrumental in the formation of the Black Cross overall. So thank you to all of those who help us to continue to do the good work. Okay, so next slide, please. So meet the Black Cross. We are the Red Cross meets the Black Church, meets the Block. That's how I like to describe it. We're scientists, we're subject matter experts, we're storytellers, we're cultural strategists who are working to advance health equity in socially vulnerable communities of color. And our methods are rooted in community-based participation and the art and science of conversation and storytelling. Sometimes those two are the same, right? And because trust, we think, is locally sourced, and these communities in which we work are so diverse, our mission is really to get as much of the right information into as many hands of cultural influencers and trusted messengers as possible. All right, next slide, please. Let's get to the objectives. I think we're a little bit behind. Next slide. Great. So 3 key objectives today. We want to learn more about the COVID-19 infodemic. If you haven't heard that term, LaToya is going to do a great job telling you all about it. We're going to learn to recognize and to respond to common barriers to vaccination, including COVID-19 related mis and disinformation. And we're going to finally learn how identity, culture, and storytelling play an important role in creating healthy changes, right? And those are changes in attitude, behaviors, sometimes values, just things that make our lives better. Next slide. And I'll turn this over to LaToya, who'll take it from here.
Well, thanks, Gail. So today, of course, we are going to do a pretty good deep dive into recognizing and responding to mis and disinformation. And I want to take a little bit of time to sort of level set. I know that everyone at this point is very familiar with the fact that we have been inundated with misinformation from the pandemic and just onward. But today we're really going to be putting it into context and talking about the impact that it's been having. And so let's talk about that. I just want to highlight this for just a moment. This infodemic that we've been living in is really just that moment where we're all sort of swimming in a sea of information, and we've gotten to the point where we're surrounded by so much of it that it becomes overwhelming. And the issue, and we'll talk a little bit more about the infodemic itself, but the issue is this key fact that next slide, so I can do a quick little illustration here, is that misinformation is well known for traveling fast. right? We know that bad news sometimes spreads fast, but that's also very true when it comes to misinformation, which is just bad information, false information, misleading information, and disinformation, which is oftentimes malicious in nature. I was talking to my daughter not too long ago, and she was saying, Mom, did you know that snow falls at this rate and rain falls at that other rate? And I said, you know what? That's the same thing that happens with misinformation and the truth. See, the fact of the matter is, snow is a lot like truth. It just sort of flurries, takes its time getting down to the ground. When it does, it's beautiful, it piles up, and it's a gorgeous sight to see. But the truth is that it falls very slowly. Whereas bad information, misleading information, just plain false information is like rain, and it gets to its first 1,500 people 6 times faster, just like rain falls 6 times faster than the truth. So we've got to be really, really aware and diligent about combating misinformation, taking it very seriously, and not assuming that we can spot it right away. And I think that's oftentimes the trouble. We sometimes think, well, other people are ingesting a ton of bad information, but not me. And I want us to all take a moment of humility and really start to embrace the idea that we've all got to be hyper aware of the dangers of misinformation that it's been having not only on culture, but also on our abilities to make decisions about our own health and the health of our communities, right? And those we serve. So let's talk a little bit about, next slide, the infodemic. So as I mentioned before, an infodemic is really just an overabundance of information, okay? Some of that information is accurate and good and needed, and a lot of that information is not. The problem is that it's really hard to find the truth when you're looking for it, especially when all that bad information is flooding the environment, okay? We already talked a little bit about the fact that misinformation is just sometimes misleading, and that disinformation is usually very dangerous, and they're both dangerous, but malicious is done with a very disinformation is put out there with very malicious intent. And we find that this information that has gotten out that's really, really bad information has disproportionately affected Black and brown communities and communities of color in general. A lot of times we don't know that we're spreading bad information. We see something, we share it, we think it's a laughable sort of thing, we share it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the fact of the matter is, some of that information is manipulative, and it's made it really difficult for us to maintain our sense of understanding what kind of decisions to make. A lot of times it's created a ton of anxiety for people. It's created a ton of mental health issues, just being inundated with all of that information all of the time. And so it's something that we really do have to take seriously. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how the pandemic made the infodemic even worse. We talked about the fact that it did disproportionately impact Latino and African American communities. It makes it very hard for us to make clear, competent, and confident decisions when it comes to our health and the health of our neighbors, our friends, and our family. And it really did make it more and more difficult for people to access the information that they needed to make a vaccine decision. And so ultimately today we're talking about how people were able to make a COVID-19 vaccine decision and how bad information got in the way of that. And if we know that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by misinformation, it's no surprise that when it came to making a decision about COVID-19 and the vaccines, that misinformation was also a stumbling block that led to lower vaccine rates and lower health literacy rates. Next slide. So here's what misinformation often looks like. There are specific types, and I want you all to become hyper aware of all of them so that when you're scrolling on social and when you see your friends and family posting content, you'll know it when you see it. The thing about social media, and let me just say this as an aside, the thing about social media is that a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today are things you're already aware of, right? They're already sort of sitting in your unconscious mind, but I want you to be so conscious of it that you stop it in its tracks when you see it. Because we know that if we want to stop the spread of a disease, we also want to stop the spread of misinformation associated with that disease. So let's look at some types of misinformation. You can see on the screen, I've got some great examples. The first one is memes. We're already familiar with memes. Everybody knows them. They're usually colorful. They're usually something that's pretty funny. It's usually a highly designed graphic, or it could be rudimentary to keep it even more clever. And we know that a lot of times it starts off as a joke, but it's so easy to reshare. And the thing about memes is that they can often cast doubt on information that's true or perpetuate information that's really, really bad, right? The next one is misleading graphs and diagrams. Now, for those of us who spend a lot of time looking through data and research, we can take it for granted that when most people look at a graph, they think they're getting the whole picture. But what we found, especially around COVID-19, and a lot of the misinformation that we see on other subjects on social media, is that it looks scientific, it looks credible because it comes in the form of a graph. But the fact is, a lot of times, you're only seeing a piece of it. It's not telling the whole story, it's not in context. And that's one particular kind of misleading or misinformation that we find. We also see malicious clippings. This is when someone is taking a video or they've done a deep fake on a photo and they've basically taken out parts of that content so that you don't get the whole thing or so that it changes the entire meaning of what that post was meant to say. Next slide. All right. We also have cherry-picked statistics. This is very much they're very similar to the graphs and the diagrams that are often taken out of context. A lot of times we'll see statistics that are picked out from a bigger survey so that we can't actually get the full picture. We don't get all of the data, and we don't know exactly what was supposed to be shared or what was supposed to be conveyed with that statistic, right? So that's one type of misinformation. And I think we often see cherry-picked statistics with regard to disinformation when people are on purpose taking pieces of something that could be credible, but then really making it false. We also have deceptive websites. You know, anyone can make a website these days. We can make them look very professional, and that is hard for people to, it makes it hard for people to decipher whether or not they're getting accurate information. And then of course there's out of context quotes. Now this is where of course you have a quotation, someone has taken the beginning or the end off of that quotation, and now it's totally changed its meaning and sometimes made the meaning something it was never meant to mean, right? And so we've got to be hyper aware of these things when we're seeing them. Now, for those of you who are ready to be misinformation warriors, I'm going to give you some strategies that you can use to really combat these things when you see it. Because what we often find is people kind of know that, okay, I know that not all websites are real. I know that people sometimes take images and they chop them up, you know, they're chopped and screwed and photoshopped, right? And so the point is, I want us to be very proactive when it comes to identifying these kinds of things and then doing something about them. I also want us to be able to explain this framework or this process to other folks. So what we're going to talk about today is the SIFT method. Next slide. The SIFT method is really just a way for you to break down the steps that you can take to fact check information. I have a journalism background, and so for me, the whole idea of fact checking is just all about getting the story right, making sure that everything lines up. But all of us can be expert fact checkers, so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to use the SIFT method. That's going to be the framework, and it stands for stop, investigate, find, and trace. Very simple. We're going to go into all of these into details. So let's just, let me go through these really quickly though. So with stop, that's when you just take a pause. You're going to discover whether or not you're sure you know where the source came from. How does it make you feel? Is it trying to manipulate you by being overly, is it inciting anger, or is it trying to make you sympathetic to something that you wouldn't otherwise be sympathetic toward? You've got to do like a sort of a gut check with it. So you're going to stop and you're going to pause. Then you're going to investigate. You're going to see where it came from. You're going to look at the sources. You're going to determine whether or not this kind of claim came up in a search engine, thinking about what. The other thing, some of you in the room may be researchers and know anything about content that is peer reviewed, right? You've got to look for multiple voices. So when you're talking about the F in find confirmation, you're going to look to see who else is agreeing with this information, okay? Or who else is combating this information, and making sure that all the content that you're pulling in comes from a diversity of sources, right? So we don't want to be caught up in a filter bubble, which we'll talk about in a little bit too. And then the last one is the T. trace the claims to their original context. And we'll talk about this, we'll show some examples, but this is really when you make sure that that graph, that statistic, that image is in context where it's supposed to be. So that's the SIFT method, and let's talk specifically about each letter. Next slide. So one way that you can practice the S and the stop is to practice click restraint. One thing I always do when we do these kind of talks is I tell someone, go ahead and put in the chat www.clickonthis.com. Who's got a free hand to participate? Clickonthis.com. Now, when it starts to pop up in the chat right where you are, I want you to simply not click on it, right? One of the most important things you can do is practice click restraint. This is where you make the active decision not to click on everything that you see. So when Nicki Minaj posts about how her cousin in Trinidad won't get the vaccine because he knew someone who got it and then they were impotent and then they were supposed to get married and then the person left them and then, you know, they had to call off the whole wedding, okay? You can decide whether or not you're going to like this. You're going to share it with everyone you know, even though it does cast doubt in a very specific way. Even though she says, listen, just pray on it. I'm not telling you what to do. It's your decision. But she's definitely framed this in a negative light. And she's going to share this with thousands upon thousands of her followers, right? So practicing click restraint is really just the act of not perpetuating content in the algorithm. It's also really important to practice click restraint when you're searching content. Your ability to not click on the first thing that you see, because it could be an ad or it could just be something that's not the best information, that's a win, okay? So that's that stop method. Go ahead and not click on everything because that spreads misinformation. Next slide. Now this next one, you know, I gotta be honest, I'm pretty guilty of this at times. It's called reading beyond the headline. We've talked about investigating your source to make sure that what you see is what you want other people to get. And when we are reading a headline and not reading the whole article in context, we really do risk spreading misinformation. So if you look at this example here, the profile comes from someone named Natural Immunity, but it looks like he's posting a study from the Cleveland Clinic, which by all means is credible. Now it says natural immunity is as effective as vaccination. Now that sounds like a pretty credible, a pretty compelling headline. But if you actually read the study by Cleveland Clinic, you would discover that that is not what the article, that's not what the research was about. In fact, Cleveland Clinic had to put out a whole statement to correct this because Mr. Natural Immunity over here, Jeffrey Myers, was pretty effective in spreading this false idea that the Cleveland Clinic did not mean to disseminate. And so we've got to investigate the source. This posting did not come directly from Cleveland Clinic. The headline was misleading. It did not tell the whole story. And I think that Mr. Natural Immunity, Jeffrey Myers, had a specific agenda when he posted it. So we always want to make sure to investigate the original source so we can get the whole story. One thing I like is that Twitter, they will sometimes, I noticed that especially a year or two ago, if you tried to share an article that you didn't read, the Twitters would say, did you read this article? We noticed you were going to share it with all your friends and family and you didn't even read it. And so it does give you that warning, but I want us to get in the habit of warning ourselves. And when we see that other folks are sharing misinformation, instead of getting into a tug of war and instead of trying to help them understand why this information is not true, you can simply ask, hey, did you read beyond the headline? Did you actually read that article before you? Really important method for fact checking. All right, next slide. All right, next we have reading upstream, which is very similar to investigating the source. Okay, this is the idea that you don't just take an article at face value. You want to make sure that you're doing the extra step. So when you're reading upstream, you're going upward, right? And that means that you are reading the article, but then you're going to go look up and you're going to say, who is this article by? And then you look up again, right? Posted. What date? Is this a fresh article? Is this old news? Have things developed since then? You really want to ask yourself these questions. Then you're going to look up a little bit further and say, well, who published this, right? You might be looking up at the headline, or you might be looking up at the publisher or the URL. So I want you to start reading upstream to gather as much information as you possibly can before you determine that this is credible and worth sharing. Next slide. So F is for finding confirmation. We know that, well, I'm an old school church girl, and so we always say where two or more are gathered, that something awesome is about to happen. So we want to see that there's more than one person, more than one credible source who can say, "Hey, yeah, this is correct." And you know who is often the two or more? Sister Google. She is always there. Girlfriend Google is always there for you when you need her. She will give you all the answers. So one of the things that I always mention that is a great practice is just to do a reverse image search. Okay, she will let you know if someone posts a picture like the one that you see on your screen right now, where it says um, China called Islam a virus and worked very hard to extinguish it in this country. They've got this whole storyline here, but they're leading you to believe that there's judgment happening. And here in China, all these people have fallen dead on the streets, right? But if you take this image and you put it over into the search engine called Google, you can just slide an image right into it. You can drag and drop it. Google will show you every instance of that image's use, including the first time it was used. And this is important because this is one way that you can fact check, yes, indeed, even images. So always use girlfriend Google when she can be of service. Next slide. Think about doing is lateral reading. This is one of my very favorite strategies. It's very simple. Again, it's very similar to reading upstream and investigating your source, but this is where we trace the claims to their original context, okay? When you do a reverse image search, you can see what that original use of that image is. You can go back and see the original use of the original data that some scientific information may have come from. And so when we're talking about lateral reading, we're really talking about looking at multiple sources, right? And trying to find the original context. So even here, you've got this great article by NPR. It says that new studies find evidence of superhuman immunity, right? And we just want to know, where did this originally come from? Because the NPR story is going to give us some information and we're going to click on them. We're actually going to open additional tabs and we're going to see if what they said was true in those original sources. So we're going to look up hybrid immunity. What does that mean? We're going to see, did Rockefeller University or any other universities put out information about this? Did the Wall Street Journal post something about this? What does the CDC say? What did the World Health Organization say? So in this way, we're tracing information and all kinds of claims back to their original source. This way, we can know whether or not it's worth sharing. Next slide. And most importantly, I want you to be aware of the filter bubble. The fact of the matter is, right now on my Instagram, or let me just say, like on my Facebook feed, the algorithms have already decided what kind of information they're going to be feeding me. And they've already decided what kind of information they're going to be feeding you. Next slide. That means that sometimes we can be in what we call a filter bubble. It means that all the information that you're getting is limited. You're not necessarily getting a diverse perspective of viewpoints, and that means you may not be getting the whole story. I love this quote that's here on the slide. It says, TikTok only needs one important piece of information to figure out what you want. The amount of time you linger over a piece of content, every second you hesitate or rewatch, the app is tracking you. And so it's going to be feeding you information that will either incite an emotion in you or that will be agreeable to what it thinks that you already like or agree with. This means you may not be getting full perspectives all the time as much as you think you are. And that also makes it difficult for you to do your own research, right? Everyone always says, listen, do your own research. But a lot of times we are at risk for trying to do our own research, but all the information that we're getting is a very lopsided view set forth by the algorithms. So I want you guys to watch this video, next slide, just to drive home that point and talk about what you can do to get out of the filter bubble. Hint, it's the SIFT method. Play. That's a commercial. No worries. And let's start it from the beginning. I don't know if we're getting sound. I think we're still not getting sound, and I think it's just because it may not be connected to the audio for its source. Well, that's okay. We can move on from this video. That's all right. But I think that what we can do is send this out to everyone after this training, because I would love for you guys to see this video and also to share it on your socials. Next slide.
Sorry about that, guys. We'll try to get this fixed before the next video. I think we have one more to play, but
Yes. And I think from here, I'm gonna pass it over to you, Gail.
Nope, I was not off mute. That'd be too easy. Okay, so now you are all in record time, I imagine, experts in media literacy. So let's get into the storytelling pieces, right? But before we do that, let's talk about the role of identity and culture in storytelling. We want to get on the same page as to how we define identity and culture. So not to put anybody on the spot, you're all anonymous, I can't see you, but who can give us a definition for culture? Does not have to be, something from the encyclopedia, just kind of a layman's term definition of culture. If you could please drop your answer in the chat, that would be amazing. Don't be shy. Tradition, yes, yes. The way we were raised and the values that your community lives by, great, yes. A set of beliefs and practices, yes. The background, way of life and community, yes, yes, and yes. All right, so we got some cultural anthropologists on the side in this session. Heritage, yes, culture is absolutely all of those things. It's also a lot more, right? Culture no longer operates in isolation. So when we think back to the dawn of humanity, we've heard that phrase so many times, cultures were separate, right? They were kind of isolated. Tribes tend to live in particular areas of the planet, so to speak. But obviously, since culture has come together and with the internet has pretty much become interdependent, and fusion is just a way of life, we have to account for culture as a dynamic force, and it impacts people and is impacted by people. And what do we know about people? Well, we know that because how people identify themselves is multifaceted and often very complex, that we must account for things like diversity, intersectionality, like I said earlier, cultural fusion, and of course, last but not least, the power dynamics in society. But nonetheless, culture is always evolving. Key takeaway. Next slide, please. So when we think about culture, we have to think of it in three ways. There's the culture itself, which you guys did a great job of explaining, but there's also the cultural influence and the cultural equity, right? So the cultural influence, how does culture influence another culture, right? Or perhaps how does an individual, or how is an individual within a particular cultural group influenced by a culture? The equity piece speaks to, let's say, how much clout or how much influence a person, an individual, an institution, an organization might have over a cultural group, right? So that's kind of cultural equity, right? Influence. It's like a currency almost. And then finally, there's the cultural lens. And that really helps us to understand how one's cultural background impacts the way they navigate the world. Next slide. Okay. So cultural influence, that's what we're most concerned about in this particular training. It operates on multiple levels of society. And as I mentioned, it impacts how we see ourselves and each other, but most importantly, our decision-making. Pop culture, let's start with that. It's really culture at the general population level. It's what I like to call baseball, Beyonce, and burritos. And pop culture is really about commonalities, right? At the society level. Origin culture. Origin culture helps us to understand distinctions. So where pop culture brings us together, origin culture is really about understanding the differences between cultural groups based on their origins. So that can be ethnicity and race, their ethnic background, so country of origin. It can be, let's say, geography, where I was born. So think rural versus urban, north versus south. In the ATL, East Side versus West Side, or the like. But really, origin culture is determined by demographics and the circumstances and conditions in which someone is raised. So the social determinants of health are very much a part of origin culture. And then finally, subculture. Now, subculture is where we get into the fun stuff, as I like to think about it. It's formed around a mindset, a lifestyle interest, a life stage potentially, or ideology. So think political ideologies, right? Whether I'm conservative, whether I'm liberal, whether I'm moderate, but also think gaming culture and all the things that go into gaming, the lifestyle of gaming. Red Bull has certainly made a huge proposition out of the lifestyle of gaming. And then, of course, things like new mom culture or just mom culture in general. There is, in fact, a culture around moms. And, you know, consumer products corporations leverage that culture to market to moms every day. Because subcultures are so highly nuanced and very tribal in nature oftentimes, the ability to connect at that level is more difficult, but it drives a deeper level of meaning and resonance. And that's why we're so concerned with it. Next slide. Now, why storytelling, you ask? Next slide. So, author Mark Turner, if any of you have ever heard of him, author of The Literary Mind, Origins of Thought and Language, tells us that narrative imagining, story, is the fundamental instrument of thought, okay? Rational capacities depend on it. And it is our chief means of looking into the future or predicting, of planning, and of explaining. What is that? Decision-making, right? So it more so perhaps than facts really kind of rule our decision-making process, at least as far as the nervous system goes. Next slide. So stories help us navigate, connect to, and influence, most importantly, the world around us. They've been used for over 40,000 years to preserve history and cultural tradition, as you shared with us, but also to share life-saving lessons, right? Things we don't want to do, not to jump off of a cliff, perhaps. And to reinforce cultural identity, community value, behavioral norms, all the things that can act as drivers or barriers to healthier behaviors and actions, right? So stories have really been used to encode the beliefs, the values, the practice, and the cultural markers of a society into the fabric of the society. We'll get more into cultural markers later, but really it is those things that signify to another person or individual that you are knowledgeable of or a part of that particular culture. So in the olden days, as we might say, it was the griot, the shaman, the medicine woman, and the artist, right, that gathered these people around the fire or the ring shed. That's why we bring together storytellers with scientists and cultural influencers. And guess what? Science has a reason for that. So there's an explanation behind all of this. We know that messages delivered as stories can be up to 22 times more memorable than just facts. So why is that? I'm not going to go into all of the details of the science, not the best qualified to do so, but I can give you a little cursory view of why it's so impactful. So first is the mirroring that happens in our brains, right? That really helps us to connect with others and to have a shared human experience, right? So there was a study at Princeton University by Yuri Hassan who discovered that when a person listening to another speaker tell a story, the same areas of both the speaker and the listener's brain will light up in an MRI. There will be changes, visible changes to the brain. And these changes can last for weeks with repetition, which is why we have multiple conversations, right? Not just one will necessarily drive that change in behavior. Language that targets the senses or the motor functions will fire off these neurons in the corresponding sensory and motor cortexes, as they say. I'm getting a little deep here, in the brain, but really that's about empathy. And it explains why just reading about nails going down a chalkboard can make all of us cringe, right? And then finally, there's the cortical activity that happens in response to facts versus stories. So, it's really igniting more areas of the brain. Facts will stimulate 2 parts of the brain. Stories will stimulate more. We have a more impactful, embodied experience as we're taking information in. Okay, next slide before we get too deep into the waters that I would rather have someone else navigate. Okay, so there's no greater story than bearing an untold story inside of you. You'll see why that's so important in just a second. So storytelling for social change. Next slide. We marry journalism with narrative storytelling, right? As LaToya mentioned earlier, journalism is very much about rational thought, logic, reporting facts and evidence, right? But we just learned that it's not the facts and evidence that's necessarily going to compel you to make a change. So narrative storytelling and that human experience that really kind of helps one connect to another through the emotions that we go through on this shared life journey is what will drive that change. We use that for 4 key things. We use it to inform people of things, information. It might be current social conditions, the fact that there's an epidemic or a pandemic in certain instances. So to inform, educate audiences around an issue, to inspire a specific action or a change in an attitude, a belief, or a behavior, right? So making a change to live a healthier lifestyle. And then to reimagine new possibilities, right? So storytelling is used in workshops to help marginalized communities to think beyond their current social conditions and to motivate them to take actions that will actually change those social conditions. But it's also used to foster agency within that group. So we help them to tell their stories, right? And so as Dr. Angelou said, there's no greater agony than the untold story that we carry inside of us. And then finally, all of that adds up to policy changes, which create better structural conditions, which make those changes to lifestyle a lot easier. Next slide. All right, so, and as I mentioned, they are in fact a form of currency in society. Next slide. That's important because we know money, money, how do I say, the impact of money depends upon in whose hands, right, that money lies. So unfortunately, that's the same case with cultural narratives. They can be double-edged swords. Sometimes they're created for good. Sometimes they're co-opted for underhanded reasons or agendas. But every day, people use cultural narratives to connect, to be inclusive, to justify a certain action or behavior, or once again, to influence. It really just helps us to make sense of the world. It helps us to convey tribal affiliation, right? If we want to kind of connect with a larger group. They're also, though, subject to what we call, I'm sorry, go back real quick to thank you. Nope. Back to, I think what is probably slide 32, if you can. If not, I think we're going ahead. Oh, you are stealing my thunder. Okay, great. Thank you. That one. Yes. So cultural narratives are also subject to narrative fallacy. And Ace knows I'm just teasing her, by the way. So narrative fallacy is really just embellishments, it's simplifications, it's co-optation to fit a social purpose. So great examples of narrative fallacy are those quotes, right? Those memes, those manipulated statistics that LaToya talked about earlier are often tools used within crafting narratives that are meant to co-opt a particular agenda or, to kind of drive attention away from something. These cultural narratives are fueled by, and the narrative fallacies within them are fueled by, and also fuel healthy doses of doubt and distrust. All right, so next slide. I think we went, okay, great, thank you. So 3 main types of cultural narratives that we're concerned with, and one more specifically today, but I'll give you the 3 because they're all relevant to you. So political and social cultural narratives, again, those tend to be ideological. It's about defending a position or an action, getting people to mobilize around a particular political issue. There are community narratives. Those are used to document the truth of a particular community, the past, the present, the past and present drivers and impacts of social conditions. And then personal narratives, right? And I think for the audience that we have today, you might be able to connect that to patient diaries, survivor stories. These are all personal narratives that are hugely impactful in things such as global pandemics, actually. But it's all about the storyteller. So next slide, let's get into the storyteller and how that operates. So we want to tell a good story, meaning we want it to be impactful, right? And it's not just a creative exercise. It actually requires a clear mission. It requires rigorous discovery or exploration or research or whatever word you want to use for that around your audience, because otherwise, how do we know how to connect? And then a storytelling strategy, which LaToya will tell you more about. But for today's purposes, we'll illustrate parts of this process, right? The COVID-19 vaccination is really what our mission is, right? Now, when we're talking about health messaging, the moral of the story could be many different things. It's the cause and the effect, the calculation that we want our audience to make based on the information that we provide. So in other words, the moral of the story is kind of what's your why, right? What do we want the audience to take away from that story as to why they would take a particular action? That's the what. The who is, as we just said, the audience, but we have to consider the whole person. And I'll get into a little bit more on how we do that. The how is our approach, which is the counter narrative approach to message development. And LaToya will very skillfully take you through that. And then finally, we know that word of mouth is the primary channel for communities of color. So we have to think of these stories in multiple formats, right? So it's not just maybe a short form video that you're watching online, but it's in-person conversations and it's social media, which is now the new social square or public square. So we focus our efforts there. Next slide. Okay. Just so you know, the information, the data that we use to help illustrate this process for COVID-19 is really targeted for these two groups, gatekeeping women and moms, and then parents and caregivers. Okay, so keeping that in mind, this is our audience. Next slide. Now, we know it's much more than the demographics that you saw on the previous slide, and I'm not going to get into all of this on this slide, but you will receive a copy of the presentation, and so you can read at your leisure. But we talked about the complex ways that identity and culture impact decision-making, right? So I'll just use a couple of insights about Naima to demonstrate this. So she identifies as Muslim, right? But what we do know is that the Muslim community in the United States is extremely diverse. And so being Muslim is not enough to know, for us to know how to message to her, right? In fact, we know that there are 80 nationalities and cultural backgrounds that constitute today's Muslim American audience. So that's quite a bit of diversity. So out of those 80 backgrounds, how am I thinking about Naima? Well, Naima, she's also a hip hop head. I know that, right? Because I'm listening in social media and I see who she follows. And you can also kind of tell by the picture, right? So yes, she does have her head covered, which is traditional for many Muslim communities. However, she's also got door knockers. If you're a hip hop fan or maybe a fan of LL Cool J, I'm telling my age, you'll know what door knockers are, but they are also tied into hip hop culture. And she hails from Philadelphia. And if you know anything about Black Philadelphia, you know the Muslim community there is of a particular sort, very tied into music, culture, and just the overall Black community in Philadelphia as a whole. So already now we're having a deeper profile of how to connect with Naima, right? So I may not reach Naima through Nicki Minaj, but I might reach her through The Roots or through Mumu Fresh. These are all people who kind of subscribe to this particular mindset, this lifestyle. We also want to take into account cultural spaces. Cultural spaces is, well, I know who my audience is, but where do I find them, right? And that's in the virtual world as well as offline. So you saw probably a lot of programming around barbershops, around nail salons, around places of worship. These are all cultural spaces where people are very engaged in very passionate views and passionate communications. and a prime place for COVID-19 and COVID-vax storytelling. And then finally, we'll want to look at, like I said, who she follows, the influencers, and how that impacts her behaviors and her attitudes toward COVID-19. Because she is Muslim, Black Muslim in particular, she may not be a part of the Nation of Islam, but she might be influenced and, adjacent to the Nation of Islam, and therefore might be impacted by Riza Islam, who we know is well known for the spread of misinformation around COVID-19. So she's a prime candidate for us to really target around correcting perhaps some misinformation or incorrect beliefs, narrative fallacies. Next slide. All right, so getting into the nitty-gritty of the COVID-vax attitudes, we've done a lot of research. We've synthesized a lot of research from academic institutions, from community-based organizations, Georgia SEAL Partners, and all of this social media listening, all of this added up to the fact that most distrust and hesitancy around the COVID vaccine can be tied to 3 areas of doubt and distrust. 1, institutions and authorities. So distrust of the government, distrust of the pharma industrial complex, as we heard it referred to by many online. And that's usually rooted in some social or socio-historical condition, event, period of time. So that means that we're going to have to dig deeper to really understand what's driving that doubt, right? Then there's the doubt around the vaccine science, which is really specific to this was made too fast, takes years to develop a vaccine, a ton of money, and how could they have possibly done this correctly, right? And then finally, the information at hand. And the information at hand is really about, I am not sold because there's specific information that I'm missing. It might be related to underlying conditions. It might be related to some of that confusion and overwhelm that LaToya spoke about that's caused by the infodemic. So for example, early on, there was a lot of communication around the fact that perhaps children were not nearly as vulnerable to COVID-19 as adults. Well, we learned that this is untrue. And in fact, they can also be carriers, right? And infect more vulnerable adults. So we had to really do a lot of work to unravel that narrative. Things that we can't really help completely because of the novel nature of the virus, but we have to really invest in communications around these missteps or learnings as they might be when it comes to the science. Next slide. So now we talked about these doubts, kind of gave you the background or what drives these different areas of the doubt, and it's all reasonable, really, when you think about it. It's unfortunate that there's such aggression sometimes in the vax, anti-vax conversation, but there's a lot of driver of that. So the sociocultural context, such as systemic racism, neglect, lack of investment in the health or medical infrastructure. I literally heard people say, well, we've been dying of diabetes for years. Why do you care now, right? Then there's the vax science, as I mentioned. Well, people don't know that the mRNA vaccine has been in development roughly 30 years, or that's how long it's been, in research or what have you. So we have to get education out there around that. And then finally, the information mayhem that came with all this sudden information about science was exacerbated by the fact that we, as healthcare professionals or medical professionals or what have you, we take for granted a lot of our baseline scientific understanding. So there's things that we need to communicate that will help people get to the point where they can start to really understand how a vaccine works. Well, first, let's talk about how the immune system works. Then we can talk about how the vaccine works with the immune system. But we took for granted a lot of baseline information that just wasn't there. And so that's what a big part of driving vaccine confidence. And by the way, these doubts, so institutions, the science, and the information at hand, this is all listed in degree of hesitancy. So from left to right, the most hesitant start on the left, institutions, ending with the least hesitant, information at hand. This can be important if you have limited funding and you need to actually get as many people vaccinated as possible. You obviously want to start with the low-hanging fruit to get to critical mass or herd immunity, population community immunity. Next slide. All right, I need to speed it up. I can talk a lot, you guys. So 10 common vax hesitancy narratives, right? We're still in the WHO, profiling the audience, trying to understand, okay, so you don't want to get vaccinated, but why, right? So we know that your barrier, your very specific barrier, like, well, it causes myocarditis in teens, is linked to one of these hesitancy narratives, okay? And again, starting with most hesitant, it's about freedom from government control and conspiracy and collusion. That is going to be the most difficult person to convert, right? Or to get vaccinated. Ending with, I just don't know, I don't have the right information. But if the right person comes along that is trusted, delivers that information, well, we can get that person vaccinated today. I've seen it happen multiple times, many times actually at this point. Okay, so next slide. Or actually, no, before we go back to the next slide, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I wanted to do a quick poll from you guys, if you don't mind. Thank you. So if you could, did everybody see the poll come up? If I can just get one person to confirm that they can see that in the chat, that would be awesome. Yes, okay, great. So please select the top 3 hesitancy narratives that you hear or that you have heard most often. So you should be able to select one of these 3. So is it freedom from control and conspiracy on behalf of the government? Is it the fact that big pharma and the government are actually colluding or conspiring to make money? Obviously, people not knowing the billions of dollars invested by multinational, collaboratives. It's about freedom. In other words, this is another freedom. So this is more about medical freedom or religious freedom, right? You might be hearing body autonomy a lot. COVID vaccines are unnecessary, right? So in other words, I don't think the threat is that high. So that's a rejection of the science. People should do their own research. Sounds a little conspiratorial to me. It's not worth the risk. Vaccines are not safe. Again, not knowing maybe the data, the evidence, not hearing the stories of weighing the risk of vaccination versus not getting vaccinated, right? COVID vaccines don't work. What's the point? It's not effective. Waiting for more information. And then I just don't know. I'm overwhelmed. So we'll give you maybe 1 minute. Okay. Has everybody voted? Perfect. Looks like that's a yes. Okay, so the results of our poll. So we've got 2. Interest. Oh, got it. Okay, so 60% at the top. So it's, yeah, so this could explain some of the lack of movement around vax rates here in Georgia, right? Because these top 2 narratives that you're hearing are in fact the top 2 most hesitant narratives, right? And so what does that mean? It means that we have work to do. We have a lot of conversations that need to be had around the history, around acknowledging what's happened, but also in acknowledging and sharing information around protections and new protocols that will prevent the atrocities of the past from ever happening again, right? So we've really got to rebuild that trust. Good storytelling, journalism, all based on trust. Next slide. Not going to stay here again. You'll get the deck, but this basically shows how nuanced these narratives can be according to which population we're engaging, right? So for a general population, if I were to ask you what was the top narrative, they would tell you, well, it's not that big a threat, right? With 50.4% of the people that we listen to saying that. Versus with Hispanic and African-American populations, they will tell you they are most hesitant at 26%. Also, it tends to be more diverse within these populations because of safety and side effects. Next slide. Okay, so again, you can read this later, but this, we did take another step. So we started general population level, right? Thinking back to how we map culture. Then we went down to kind of the origin culture, ethnicity, that kind of thing. And then we went down to that tribal or subculture, right? Mom culture, dad culture, parent culture, caregiver culture. So we just illustrated kind of how these narratives will shapeshift according to kind of what level of the population we're really surveying or listening to. So that's why it's so important to go deep on your cultural background or ethnicity as you're interviewing for groups. Next slide. Okay, so the how. This is what you've all been waiting for, right? We had to give you a little science because we know we have a scientific community that we're talking to today. But the how do we now address all of these challenges or this hesitancy? So next slide, the counter-narrative approach is about targeting those narrative fallacies that we mentioned with counter-narrative strategies. So what does that mean, right? Well, we start with the narrative that's supporting the reason or the explicit barrier to vaccination. And then we develop a general message, right, based on what we call the narrative fallacy. So we're listening to people give their reasons for not getting vaccinated. We're finding the common kind of fallacy. It might be lack of understanding of a particular scientific concept or whatever it might be. It might be a rumor that was spread by Nicki Minaj. And we'll then find evidence, what we believe is the most compelling based on what we know about the audience to address that and create a core message, right? Well, that may not be enough, just that core message, because culture and identity plays such a huge background. So we give counter-narrative strategies based on what the actual barrier is, the narrative is, and then kind of how people think about it from, a cultural standpoint. And then finally, out of that comes the content, right? The counter narrative, the actual counter narrative. So we take a core message, we wrap it in culture and identity and, salient pieces of culture and identity that will actually be meaningful to people. And then we spit out on the other end of this machine, what we call the story. Next slide. So an example of narrative, counter narrative kind of interplay in social media, right? The anti-vax narrative, counter-narrative conversation, I like to say, is like a cha-cha or a Harlem Shake that never stops, right? It's this ongoing dance. So the one that you'll see, I'll just explain the first one. The first the anti-vax narrative was vaccines are not safe, right? And so then we see content from the pro-vaxxers that say, but there's no evidence that says it's not safe based on the reasons that you're giving that it's not safe. Data actually shows, right? So that's that response. Well, then the anti-vax narrative comes back and says, well, your data, I don't trust it. People do your own research. So then what do we have to do? We have to come back. And by the way, usually when they say do your own research, they share, to make it convenient for the audiences, a link or a study or some sort of evidence in air quotes, that would substantiate their position. And then we come back and we say, okay, so you did your own research, but did you pop the filter bubble, right? Did you get out of that contained bubble that's really created by your particular interests and those of the people that you are connected to in social media? That's what the algorithm is going to keep serving you. Okay, next slide. And then I'm going to just tee this up for LaToya, and then she'll bring it home for the most part. I might jump in a little bit, but 6 steps to effective counter narratives. Okay, so the first thing we do is we identify the barrier in the narrative, as we said. We then identify a clear target in the narrative. We call this the heel or the narrative fallacy, right? So what's not making sense, right? What's not jiving? We then acknowledge the moment, right? So once we know kind of we've mapped this particular narrative to kind of what the driver of distrust is, we know more about the background of this hesitancy. And so we know that we need to acknowledge, based on who we're talking to, that yes, forced sterilization was a very real part of our history. And that is in fact why some people are very concerned that the vaccine is about government control and population control more specifically. So we have to acknowledge that, but then we have to talk to people about how that can't happen anymore, right? We have to let people know how much oversight actually goes into the development of a vaccine. We have to then present the facts and the evidence otherwise known as the hook. She'll tell you more about that. And then we or it can be part of the hook. And then we meaningfully connect through the culture, through cultural influencers. Those are people of the culture or who have a great deal of cultural equity in the particular cultural group that is the audience. Cultural markers, which I mentioned earlier, such as language, imagery, things that belong to a cultural group that signify you are familiar with me, you are culturally competent to speak to me about this particular topic. Openers will help you prime the audience to kind of loosen them up a little bit, right? Or get them more receptive to hear what you're about to say. The hook will grab the audience's attention, and that's about deep cultural resonance, paradox, humor, in combination with that evidence and the facts that I mentioned, okay? And then finally, you always got to tell them what to do, right? So we have to end every story with a call to action, right? Whether it's get vaccinated, look for more information, all about the journey and where they are on that journey. So I've said quite a bit. Thank you for your patience, Ms. LaToya. I'd love for you to pick it up from here.
Sure. Next slide. So we're going to be talking now about execution. So at this point, you understand how to address misinformation as a consumer of content. Gail has talked to you about how we use storytelling to craft messages. And now we're going to be talking about how, when you get down to be the content creator, you can make messages that resonate with your audiences that make sense. Of course, we have a marketer's mind, right? We think about how we need to think about the audience and about how addressing all these barriers and all that. But I want you to now be thinking as a marketer as well, and in your approach to creating counter narrative messages that really will decrease vaccine hesitancy. But so this is all about execution. If you haven't been taking notes up until this point, go ahead and get some pen and paper, or pull out your mobile device and open up Instagram, and let's think about how we can actually create the messages that are going to create a little bit of movement where we're not seeing it right now. Okay. The great thing is that at the end of this training, you are all going to receive a toolkit, and this toolkit is going to have with it all of the things that we've been talking about, including a master messaging grid that will address each of the false narratives that we've been discussing. And this is an example that you see here on the screen of what it's going to look like. It's basically like everything you're going to get, right? So for instance, if we're trying to create a message, and let me just back up for just a second and remind you of this important point. When you want to create a message that you want someone to actually receive, it has to be relevant, it has to be credible, it has to be all the things. Otherwise, you're just talking and it doesn't ever make it to the other person. So I want you to remember that every time you sit down to make a social post, you are making a message because you want someone to do something. And you also want to make sure that that message is so strategic and so intentional, just as Gail has already discussed. So that is the point of you thinking through what I'm going to show you today, so that it all gets embedded into the actual social post. Because most of the time when we're on social media and we're consuming content, we're not thinking of all the strategy that often went to the posts that we're just taking in so passively. So we're going to be really intentional content creators. In your messaging strategy, okay, you're going to see this first point, right? We're going to identify the false narrative. And so your messaging grid is going to have a specific false narrative. So for instance, we all talked about the one, it's not worth the risk. You'll see that in the bold top line, right? But this toolkit that you're going to receive will actually show you, okay, when we're trying to address this particular false narrative, okay, maybe you're open, but you're not aware of all of the science, you're going to think, okay, this category, it falls into the side effects category. So the toolkit that you're going to get is going to show you, okay, for this particular argument, we're talking about side effects, which means I'm not going to be talking to them about, government control, or we're not going to be talking about efficacy. It's not that I don't believe you, I just think that there's going to be some side effects, right? So in particular, they're probably worried about something like myocarditis, right? That's the barrier. So we want to address that belief in particular. So your grid is going to have the category, the barrier, and then a belief statement, so that you can hit it right on the head. You know exactly what they're saying, what the story they're telling themselves, that narrative. And we've got it for you right here. The COVID-19 vaccine is causing myocarditis in young people, so it's probably not safe for my young person, right? So if this is what they're telling themselves, remember, our strategy is to present a counter narrative. And we can do that with something that we're going to call calculated risks. That's one of our counter narrative strategies, or one called side time, right? So if they're concerned about side effects, calculated risk could be the one that we use, which is to say, hey, I know you're calculating okay, if this barrier really does exist, what is the calculated risk if you don't get vaccinated? There are other risks. Are you calculating all of them? Or we could use the side time approach, which is something that we'll also show you in a little bit. I've got some great examples, but that's just another approach where we're really saying, hey, here's the science. Now, in the grid, you're also going to get the general message piece. They are specifically targeted for a specific demographic, so it's really helpful, but that's where you're going to get lots of facts and stats that you can embed also into your message. So remember that just because you're sitting down to make a post does not mean that you get away with being really strategic about it. That's what this whole conversation is about. Okay, next slide. So when you're talking to a person, right, you've got to consider the context. That's number 2. Gail hit on that earlier today, and let's talk about it in a little bit more in depth. You got to know who you're talking to at the end of the day. And so that not only means you understanding your audience, what moves them, what drives them, what are their attitudes, what are their beliefs, but you also want to think very deeply and very seriously about the context in which they're living. That can mean the current event, like the current events, what's happening in culture, what's the climate, what's happening in news, how are people talking to their friends and family, what are people's anxieties around. But the context can also be historic in nature, right? So if we know that we're talking with a specific group of people who have dealt personally or understand intimately about historical injustice, then that's the area that we have to be sensitive to when we're creating messages, whether they're dealing in systemic racism, if they have knowledge, or just the mere fact that the government has engaged in experimentation and abuse among women, on Black bodies, on brown bodies, all of these things. We have to think about the fact that this is the world in which that person is living. So when we're messaging them, we have to know that they're thinking about provider bias. People don't believe me when I'm in pain, so why would I do this, right? So we want to be very conscious of who we're talking to. That's number 2. So let's talk about the next step when we get to actually start posting. Next slide. We want to start with an opener, like Gail mentioned. So you want to prime your audience. Now, this is where you sort of crack the door and you appreciate an opportunity to have an in with that person. And so you want to soften your delivery with something like, framing. Like, we're going to frame this in a way that's very approachable, that makes sense to you, and that is not going to put them on guard, because the point of an opener is truly just to let them bring their guards down. So if you look at the example that we have here, this is probably meant to be a carousel. So the bottom image says, what did you bring home from the cookout, right? Very soft entry. Here, what we're going to do is introduce it as something that's familiar, that's common, non-threatening, but just remind them, hey, you probably brought something back from that cookout, more than just your to-go plate, right? And so if you scroll through that actual carousel, I'm flipping my finger because in my mind I'm swiping, but you would see the next image, which would be that top one that says new COVID-19 infections are up 316% from the last Labor Day. And so we're just reminding people, hey, soft in the opener before I hit you with these statistics and remind you that numbers are on the rise, is to say, hey, I know that you might want to consider social distancing. At the time that was of the utmost importance. And so the questions here are just, how can we make it a soft entry so that we can give people the information that they need? All right, next slide. The purpose of a story, this is a beautiful quote, is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. And that is baseline. Next slide. All right, so the next thing you want to think about is how you can make it real, make that information mean something through a hook. You want to include a hook when you're creating those messages on social media, or even if these messages are appearing in other ways, in your group chats, on websites, if you're creating printed content, it all matters. But you want to create a hook. This is just where you are using framing, or maybe a literary device like a metaphor, simile, paradox, humor, anything that will make people, again, pull down those barriers and give an option to share the information that you want to share with them. A lot of times, the actual tactic that you're using is, go back for me. Am I running out of time? The actual tactic that you're using can be the hook itself. So you remember during the pandemic, if you'll go back two more times for me. If you remember during the pandemic, a lot of people were watching verses, right? You could see Fat Joe versus Ja Rule, or you would see Brandy versus Monica. They'd be performing. And so we would see this image all the time. So this image itself is the hook. It's the thing that gets someone's attention, that makes them more open to receiving the information. So if you see the option down in the one on the bottom, we've taken that same concept, right? And we've taken verses and we've put traffic fatalities. You need something to compare. This versus COVID-19 deaths, right? So this is the hook itself, the tactic that we're using. So always think about how you can integrate that into your social post. Got to be strategic. Next slide. Cultural markers is another big one. This is where you actually establish credibility by identifying the thing that makes sense for the audience that you're talking to. These are going to be your language cues, imagery cues, anything that indicates that you are a part of that community. And again, this is something that can be the storyteller or the actual subject matter expert that you're using can also be the actual cultural marker. And we'll look at an example of that in just a second. But if you look over here on the slides, we've got storytelling as a literary device, right? So when Black folks tell a story, we will usually say something like, well, all stories have these three elements: introduction, climax, and resolution, right? But when we start off, we don't start off with once upon a time. We start off with, so tell me why. And then you already know a great story is to follow, right? Or the climax in the middle, you always know it's coming because you'll hear the person say, well, come to find out, aha, that's where you know the twist is coming, right? So if you can integrate those kinds of things in the way you create a post around COVID-19, those cultural markers say, okay, I'm a part of your group. This is how we talk. So this is how I'm gonna talk to you, right? Or the other post, I love this one. It just says, we full, Grady. If you're from Atlanta, if there's some Grady babies in here, you already know. This only makes sense if you are from here. You don't have to say, our hospitals have suddenly been inundated with, no, we full, because that's how we talk, right? So the actual way you use your copy and your imagery, these are all opportunities to embed a cultural marker to make sense for your audience. Next slide. So lastly, we'll talk a little bit about your calls to action. When it comes to COVID-19, of course, we want people to do something. So we always want to include in every post that you make a call to action. This is something that you want them to do. Some important notes. Your calls to action need to make sense for where people are in their journey. So if they're at the beginning of their journey and they're just now in an education phase, you're just trying to get them to understand, the most you can tell people is to go ahead and get more information, get involved, learn more, right? Learn how you can pop your filter bubble if that's where they're at, if that's where the conversation is. But sometimes you want to go ahead and just say, look, get vaccinated. And sometimes your calls to action could be in the form of a hashtag, depending on where it is. So if you have got this on Instagram and you're doing hashtag VaxUp, that is a call to action. And it's also a cultural marker because that's how we talk about vaccination. We can just say VaxUp and everyone knows what we're talking about right now. And so I want you guys to think about where your audience is, what they're willing to do, and the importance of actually giving them something to do. Gail? Next slide.
Okay, so we were going to play some examples, but to be considerate of everyone's time, we're going to close this at 3:30. And just so you know, and you can watch the content in the deck or the presentation once that's emailed to you early next week. Okay, so for the naysayers, we just went through kind of these techniques that are used in storytelling, such as opener, cultural markers, the storyteller, and the hero, and the hook and the mission, right? So these things we've talked about throughout the course of this presentation as being impactful in storytelling. Now what I'm doing is just tying it back to that neuroscience that we talked about earlier in terms of why stories themselves are so impactful, right? So the opener, what does that do? It ties into the phenomenon of neural coupling, right? And it helps people to really begin to imagine themselves in a particular scenario just by saying, okay, there's something that you and I share. So whatever story you're telling me, there's a stronger possibility that I'm going to want to understand it, know it, or can visualize myself in it. The cultural markers tie into the neural coupling, the mirroring really, but also the cortical activity, so to speak, right? So as far as the cultural markers go, it helps, it fires those neurons. When I use a Black storytelling literary device, my neurons fire off because I resonate culturally with it, as do the neurons of my audience who share my cultural background, right? There's a meaning that's happening there. And so we're now starting to kind of help these people to embody the information that they're hearing, not just process the information that they're hearing. The storyteller or the hero, we talked about the importance of the storyteller or the hero, and I don't think I talked as much as I usually do about it. But that's where cultural equity comes in, right? It matters who's telling this story. We have to be able to connect. We have to be able to resonate. We want to connect on a human level, but we also want to connect on a cultural level. And stories help fire off that oxytocin, right? Kind of when something is resolved in the story. And so again, these feel-good feelings we want people to have, whether, being based on recognizing that Kenny Burns is the host of this webinar, or maybe hearing a popular song that's attached to a post in social media. So for example, this morning I posted the promo flyer for this training and I tied it to Slick Rick's Storyteller song. Obviously none of the explicit lyrics, but just the very beginning, once upon a time, not long ago. And then finally, the hook and the mission, right? So the hook, it is about getting people more primed and open to receive information. It's also about creating a question in the mind, right? So because all of these other things are in place, the fact that I trust the storyteller, the fact that you've used cultural markers or spoken to me in my language, the fact that you presented a scenario that I can imagine myself in, now you can present evidence or that factual data that makes me question my existing belief, right? And once a person is challenged, that belief is challenged, well, cortisol happens or fires off. Now that, it can be a bad word in a lot of spaces, but it does heighten your focus and it heightens your memory. So what does that mean? Now I'm paying attention, right? I'm sitting up and I'm paying attention. And then of course the dopamine, also experiencing that intense emotion, you remember more. All right, so I don't know if I'm gonna let LaToya wrap this part up before we get to kind of the tools and resources that are available to registrants and beyond.
Yeah, next slide. I know you get it. And so I'm gonna, there we go. Yep, so I wanna show you guys an example toolkit. Again, you're going to have all of the targeted narratives in there, the topics, engagement strategies, and cultural markers. But this is a specific example where Alive and in Color, we have actually employed all of these things. And I want you to see how it looks in execution. I want you to pay attention to the fact that we have very specific targeted narratives that we're going to address in this video. It's about freedom, that's going to be addressed. It's not worth the risk, that's going to be addressed. And I want you to listen for those things. We're obviously speaking specifically to the topics around mandates are forcing you to make a decision right now. So we want you to make that decision. It's going to address side effects, because we know that's what you're thinking about. And we're also thinking about the layers of protection that vaccines offer. And then in terms of engagement strategies, you are going to see that framing is used here, okay? And some literary devices like similes, like a raincoat is going to be used, and I want you to listen out for those. And then the cultural markers here, you're going to hear several times where the doctor himself pulls specific culturally congruent thoughts here, but he himself, as a board certified doctor, is also a cultural marker. He's a Black man, he's credible, and he's on TikTok, so obviously cultural marker. All right, so let's play that video now. Be listening.
A lot of content here
There we
about
go.
science from people who have never sat down and studied it, so I thought it would be helpful to come on here and clear some stuff up. I'm Dr. Darian Sutton. I'm a board-certified emergency medicine physician, and I'm here to clear up some basic concepts that often get confused. Number one, you are completely correct. It is 100% your decision whether or not you get vaccinated, but if you choose not to get vaccinated, you can't expect the same level of access to the community as someone who is vaccinated. Mandates don't force you to get vaccinated, they force you to make a decision. And if you choose not to get vaccinated, your access to public spaces and workplaces changes because you are at a higher risk of getting a COVID-19 infection. And many will reply, well, COVID-19 vaccines don't prevent COVID-19 disease, and that is false. With the latest information that we have from the CDC in the setting of the more transmissible Delta variant, COVID-19 vaccines still prevent and reduce your risk of symptomatic disease by more than 5 times and reduce your risk of hospitalization by more than 25 times. We also have data that shows that those who get vaccinated and still unfortunately get infected with COVID-19 have been shown to have lower viral loads and to clear their viral infections in a shorter amount of time than those who are unvaccinated. Vaccines aren't 100%, no vaccine is, but they still significantly reduce your risk of getting infected. Think of vaccines like raincoats. You'd probably put one on if you knew it was going to rain outside with the understanding that it was going to protect you from heavy rain, but you still might get wet. The argument that vaccines aren't 100%, therefore I will not get one, just doesn't really make sense. For example, a bulletproof vest may not protect you from every bullet, but if you knew there was a high chance of getting shot, you'd probably still put one on. If you're concerned about the risk of COVID-19 vaccines, I completely understand. Extreme rare risks still do exist. However, the risk of pericarditis, myocarditis, acute kidney injury, pulmonary embolisms, and strokes are substantially higher with a COVID-19 infection. For example, almost every patient that I admit for symptomatic disease of COVID-19 gets placed on anticoagulation medication because the risk of developing a clot with COVID-19 is that high. By choosing not to get vaccinated, you chose the higher risk option, so you can't get upset when someone doesn't want to share an office with you or sit next to you in a restroom. Hopefully this helps you to understand the perspectives of those who are vaccinated and frustrated and may not want to choose the higher risk option that you may have chosen for yourself.
So I hope that you were able to see how that plays out in execution by using all the strategies that we provided for you today. Next slide.
Right.
Get it? Got it? Good.
So unfortunately, we don't have time to play the second example that we wanted to play. And I did also want to make sure that we could address the question in the audience, which I think Mr. Glapian, I hope I'm saying that correctly. Isn't it also wise to frame your hook according to the audience's interest? Absolutely. And one of the things that I was going to say toward the end of this is that the counter narrative approach is really about the techniques, but making it work is up to the communicator, right? Because that's where we bring in locally sourced insights. You are the expert, right? The trusted messenger, the peer ambassador, the cultural influencer. So all of these things are, devices that you then wrap culture around. I hope that was helpful in explaining that. As far as, let's see, I think you want to go next slide. So this is just an example of calculated risk at work, right? And so you heard a number of references to Nicki Minaj. This was in fact developed not directly in response to Nicki Minaj, but we certainly wanted to address a lot of the mayhem that tweet or that post or created or stirred up within communities of color as it relates to the vaccine and fertility issues specifically. So whether it be male or female fertility. Okay, next slide. All right, so before we jump, and I can stick around. I think Ace can too. We can take some questions in case anyone has to jump. But I just did want to let you guys know how you get more resources and information. So first of all, there's Alive and in Color, the platform. You may have heard me say that before. It is both a community engagement hub that is accessible to anyone and everyone. You'll find a video gallery on the hub, information about the vaccines. You'll also find training resources. But if you register, and we'll send information out on that, you'll get access to advocacy tools and resources, additional information. So there'll be a full toolkit available to other people. There's a peer networking community, and I think I'm jumping ahead of myself. Yes. So there's the peer networking community, as I mentioned, which is for ambassadors, advocates, trusted messengers. So as you learn these things, we want to connect you with other people who are interested in accomplishing the same mission so that you guys can correspond, share information, share insights, whatever it might be. Next slide. Yep. Is that the right? Nope. The next slide. Nope, we're going backwards again. Yeah, there we go. So that's the COVID Vax Training Library. These are the publicly available resources as it relates to vaccine training. We've been doing this and have been refining it, right? If you research storytelling, they'll tell you that every good storyteller is constantly refining their story. And so we've got different projects or highlights from different projects. Mercy Care is one of them that will be featured on this page. But again, if you join the community, you'll get even more information, such as a full campaign of content. So that's at least 30 days. If you're, at least 30 pieces, but more posts that you can use if you're posting every single day, or it'll last for 6 weeks if you post for 5 days each week, but you'll have enough content around COVID-19, COVID-19 vaccination updates, as well as other health equity issues or challenges that Mercy Care addresses, such as affordable housing, food security, those types of things. And then lastly, next, this says Hub Training Library, but this is really a snapshot of our advocacy tools and resources, and it's searchable. So when you log on or you become a member, you can search for the type of asset or information you'd like based on geography, based on topic, or based on population group. So if I want to look for information that is specific to African-American youth and young adults, that is in video format, and that is about COVID-19, I can do that. Or I can switch those things up and search by other things to get to a different population. So again, trying to really be helpful in helping you address nuances between these different cultural groups. So thank you so much. I want to ask and see if anyone has any questions, any burning questions that they would like us to address. Thank you for the applause. We always appreciate that. Any questions? No? Okay. All right. All right. I love to see it. We love to see it. We love to see the hand claps. But if you have any other questions, my information is at the end of the deck. You will receive that early next week, along with links to all the other resources. Because you registered, you do get the toolkit, so don't worry about that. But we absolutely would like you to join the network still. And otherwise, I guess, LaToya, would you like to share any closing words with the audience?
No, I appreciate you all for being here. I hope that you will keep all this stuff top of mind and share it in casual conversation.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. And have a great rest of the week.